Today we're going to talk about sprinting for the win. So this was a presentation originally for the conference Science in Cycling, which is the conference that precedes Tour de France. So I gave this in Dusseldorf a few years ago and have updated it a little bit since then. My co-author on this is Paolo Manaspa, who's the Chief Science Officer at the Australian Institute of Sport and has an academic position at Edith Cowan University. So there will be a few parts to this. First, I want to convince you, and maybe I don't need to convince this audience, that sprint finishes in mass start cycling are exciting. Then we'll talk about a demand model. So the aerodynamic drag and so forth that causes you to need power. Then we'll look at a supply model that we've been developing, and then we'll take those two together to explore some modeling scenarios. And feel free to interrupt at any time. I also have programmed breaks within the talk. So if you want to wait until the end of a section, that's fine, but also feel free to flag me down. You know, mass start cycling is unique because the drafting keeps riders together on flat races. So you have aerobically gifted riders who may not be particularly muscularly powerful towards the front, but then you also have the sprinter types who don't have that aerobic capacity necessarily, but they've got enough that they can stay in the draft and get to the finishing straight. And you know, this is unique in sport because in endurance sport. And I'll show you this picture here. I Googled exciting marathon finish. That was my keyword. And this one was thought to be exciting because I guess they were within about 30 meters of each other. And I think that contrasts a lot with what you know to be the exciting reality of mass start cycling finishes. So there we go. And I like to kick this off with a quote from Don DeLillo's End Zone. He's talking about a football running back, and he says, speed. He had sprinter's speed. Speed is the last excitement left, the one thing we haven't used up, still naked in its potential, that mysterious gift that thrills the millions. And so what I want to do is try to convince you, well, are sprint finishes really that exciting? And do they really thrill the millions? And so for that, I'm going to briefly stop this share, and I'm going to pull up a video hang on, whoa, stop. Okay, now. Okay, so share this. I'm sorry, this is not supposed to be a letdown here, but I don't see the video that I just opened. So what I'll do is, we'll just share my entire screen, and that should do it. Okay, you're seeing a black screen? Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, I'll just let this speak for itself. We'll see if you think that sprint finishes are exciting after this.
we can see Hushoff as well. This is going to be the flick as they cross the concord. Right now into the final two bends. A left-hand sweeper followed by the right-hand sweeper into the Champs-Elysees, and that's when you've got to be in second or third position. Everybody's right up there. Pataki's there, Hushoff is there, and so too is Mark Cavendish. Hushoff is up there. I have to say, Pataki's in third position. As they come up to the finish now, the leaders and Hushoff. Is he going to pull off the big surprise as Tor Hushoff breaks for the line? Now where is the man Smith? There he goes, over the top. Somebody just launched him, and forget it, because Mark Cavendish is streets ahead of the Tour de France when it comes to a sprint finish. And Pataki comes over in second place. He will win the green jersey. Or it's as if somebody just pulls a catapult. Il messaggio avanti 500 metri parte Fabio Sabatini per lanciare lo sprint di Elia Viviani che ha alla sua ruota Giacomo Nizzolo. Vediamo se Cavendish prova ad anticipare tutti, deve partire un pochino in anticipo perché è un po' indietro. Con lungo Sabatini si sposta, parte Viviani, ha preso un po' troppo ma è partito Cavendish in anticipo, c'è anche Nizzolo, c'è anche Belletti. Vediamo la volata di Cavendish per rimontato nettamente tutti, è vicino a quota 101. La raggiunge pochissimo su Giacomo Nizzolo. Cavendish pour l'instant il est un petit peu fermé, Marc Cavendish fait ça va s'ouvrir dans la roue de Toulouchef peut-être pour le long de la Lustrade. Osler qui lance le sprint désormais, Cavendish il va faire l'effort maintenant. Cavendish qui est en train de revenir sur Osler, Richard ne semble maxi maintenant, ça va se jouer pour ses deux jambes. Cavendish peut-être remonter Osler, Osler qui va peut-être reprendre la victoire, Cavendish est en train de remonter, Cavendish Osler c'est la pause de la pression dans ce sprint, ici sur le long de marais, Osler a réussi à repousser. Attendez, j'ai l'impression que finalement Cavendish est passé, il est persuadé d'avoir gagné. Il est pour la forme qui revient. C'est incroyable. Et c'est sur la ligne. J'aimerais vraiment voir la photo finish. C'est sur la ligne. Thomas looks over his shoulder to see where Cavendish is, and he's sitting behind your trainers at the moment into the final corner. Is he too far back? He almost collides. Cavendish is about 10 back. He's behind Anna Goss, and now Cavendish moving his way through it. He possibly is behind Rifle. Oh, so close, they're super tight. Anna Goss drives. He's going to the line now. Let's look at the left side of the street. Left where it's at. Cavendish is making his way through. Oh, he's done it. Cavendish has done it. He's going to be the world champion. Oh, yes. Mark Cavendish is the world champion. Oh, Mark Cavendish is the world champion. Unbelievable. On the outside is Roger Bettison looking after their man, and then of course Andre Greipel, who's taking one more final bet and one sweeper here as the Mayfield just makes the junction and makes the cover as the Cavendish comes up onto the wheels of the down bend from Roger Bettison. 500 metres to go, the great leg is still clear, but the attack is coming. A final effort by the white jerseys for Bonsenhagen. Cavendish is going to have to come a long way down. Nicholas Roach is opening up the sprint. Luis Leon Sanchez and Patrick right here comes the best side. And a white jersey grits his teeth, he chases Luis Leon Sanchez, he locks him, and can he get by? Roach is so close to winning this, he slips across the road. Cavendish had just won his second stake in the Tour de France. He joins the great sprinter, Andre Danegal, with 22 wins in the Tour de France. What a finish, and that's got to be one of his best ever victories. That finish field came from afar to 10 riders back, with the rain just starting to come out of the clouds here up over Brive-le-Gaillard, and this man, look at that relief, joy, the mountains are behind him. Oh, yeah, but look at the speed, unbelievable. This man is the man who wanted to win.
Okay. Whose heart rate is up? Anybody? I know mine is. So now let's go back to this, and I'll quit trying to be fancy with my screen. How about that? You can see my slide again? Okay. So I hope I've convinced you that sprint finishes are exciting if you weren't already convinced. And so now the question is, for this talk, what can modeling tell us? Can it help us as sports scientists and coaches? Can it help us give athletes more of that gift that thrills the millions? So let's start by talking about the demand model. So this is the model we originally published in 1998. It still holds up today, although we've simplified it for field studies. And I won't go into the boring details of each of these, but the big message is that our model, as it should, includes a term for aerodynamic drag, which can be the largest drag depending on the situation, but going fast over level ground, it certainly is the dominant force. You can also have changes in potential or kinetic energy. So potential energy would be going up or downhill, but changes in kinetic energy would be associated with acceleration. And so sometimes when you're on the track or in a sprint and you're very early in that sprint, the dominant term, it may actually be the acceleration term, not yet the aerodynamic term. Of course, there's rolling resistance, and there's lots of work done on low rolling resistance tires and tubeless tires and so forth. And then, of course, there's drivetrain efficiency, which I know gets a lot of attention these days with fancy lubricants and bearings and so forth. So that's the broad picture for the model. And this is a case of, I guess, being in the right place at the right time. This is back in the 90s, and I was working with a team EDS, and we had SRM power meters early in the 90s, and almost no one else did. So I had that, and I also had access to the Texas A&M wind tunnel through friends of mine. So John Cobb and Steve Head used to regularly go to the Texas A&M wind tunnel to test products. And I met Doug Milliken there, and we collaborated on this project. And what we did was we took 6 cyclists into the wind tunnel. This is an overhead view. And in fact, some of you may know Andy Coggin. That's him. He was a subject in this study. So we measured their drag area. And then we basically went across the street. So across the street from the Texas A&M wind tunnel is an airport with a relatively flat surface. And our cyclists rode up and down the taxiway at a variety of speeds, always constant speed or as close as they could. We measured power and speed with the SRM. We measured wind speed directly with an anemometer, and we got wind direction from the control tower. So it was pretty funny. They gave us a walkie-talkie, so we had our own call sign. We were Biker One, running around out on the taxiway, and periodically we'd have to get off the taxiway when a plane would come through. Kind of fun. And we ended up going to the county and getting the surveyed grade, because initially our data weren't looking right. And it turned out, we thought that the taxiway was flat, and it wasn't. It had about a 0.3% grade, which is easily detectable in the data. And some of you may know Robert Chung and his virtual elevation method, and this was really the start of that. This was our protocol, and I'm just going to go right to the results. These are our results, and what I'm showing here is the power that we measured with the power meter, with the SRM power meter, nicely calibrated and so forth. And then this is the power that we predicted based on the model. And what you see is that they agree quite nicely with an R-squared value of 0.97 and a standard error, the estimate of 2.7 watts. And, I should probably be pretty happy with that. But those of you who have ever been in Texas in the early spring, you will know that it can be astonishingly windy. And not only windy, but the wind gusts and it changes directions constantly. So those are the conditions we were in during this. And we only got one measure of wind speed within each trial and one measure of wind direction. So I think, you know, we did everything we could, but the weather did everything it could to mess us up. And this is as bad as it can get. So I think 0.97 for an R squared is as bad as you're ever going to see out of this model. And any decent conditions, you're going to get something better. Now, as good as those results are, and I should be really happy with them, I know that there are some serious limitations. The first one is that we had to go to a wind tunnel, and most people don't have access to a wind tunnel. You would have to pay to travel to one. You would have to pay, I think, over $1,000 an hour to test in a wind tunnel. And then even after you've done that, you don't know for sure if the position your rider held in the tunnel is the same that they'll hold when they're riding and maneuvering a bike and under stress and so forth. You will never be able to get tire testing data on the exact tire and the exact surface. And, you know, in terms of bearing testing, if you're going to test the bearings, you're going to have to pull them out of the bike, and so they won't be the bearings that are in your bike. So there are some limitations. The big ones, though, we tested at steady state. We told our riders to hold steady velocity as well as they could within the test section. And on average, we were at a very submaximal power of only 200 watts. And that doesn't look at all like important cycling events. As you know, road time trial will be, you know, high 300s to low 400s, maybe mid 400s, depending on the rider. Watts, that is. The track sprint events, 500,000 and team sprint, those events will have massively non-steady state speed, so huge acceleration terms, and they'll have powers of well over 2,000 watts, as you'll see in a little while. And then, of course, the individual and team pursuit, where you'll see very high power, very high acceleration in the opening lap, and then very, very high power throughout the rest of the race. And then, of course, the road race with all its variability, which is our focus for today. So these are different than our very controlled experiment. So, you know, could our model stand up to real world important cycling event conditions? And so we thought that the ultimate modeling challenge would actually be track sprint. So in this case, this happens to be data from Sean Eady back when he was world champion. And what you see here is this is him doing a standing lap, and he's going from, you know, well, as you probably know, SRMs don't collect data at no speed and no cadence. So they start at I think it's 40 RPM, could be 30. But what you see here is that he is reaching over 2,500 watts within this standing start lap. And he's also reaching around 20 meters per second by the end of the lap. So huge power, non-steady state power, and huge acceleration. So the question is, can our model stand up to this challenge? And so again, I guess my whole career is that I've been in the right place at the right time. So here's another example. I was able to team up with Scott Gardner, Martin Barras, and Dave Martin, all with Cycling Australia at the time. And we wrote this paper with 3 goals in mind. Can you get accurate CDA from field trials? Can we skip the wind tunnel? Can you model large accelerations using our technique of forward integration, just finite integration? And can you accurately predict speed from known power? And so for the first part of that, we actually just revisited the Texas A&M data, because we had the field trials and we had the wind tunnel data. And so we had everything on both sides of the equation. So all you have to do is flip it around and you can solve for the field-derived CDA. And so we did that. And what you see here is pretty good agreement. within 1.1%, so 261 to 258. This is square meters is drag area or CDA. And that, again, that's pretty good, but I think it's actually better than that. And the reason I say that is because one of the subjects did not wear the same kit. It was really, really cold inside the wind tunnel. And he had a jacket on in there, and then he did not wear that. We realized later he did not wear that out on the field trials. So if you throw his data out, now you're within a very tiny percent of agreement. So 0.4%. Yeah, so I think you'll agree that we, at least in this data set, we got very realistic values for CDA equivalent to a wind tunnel. And then the second part was to model, again, this field data from these Australian cyclists. And here's a flow chart. We get, as you saw earlier, you don't get data at the start. You have to wait until the data collection starts in the SRM. But from that initial point, that one point, we would get the speed and the power. We would calculate the demand to actually go that fast. So, you know, in early on, the demand is actually very low because you're not going very fast. So the aerodynamic drag and the rolling resistance, so forth, are very low. And when the power was higher than the demand, then we calculated an acceleration. And then based on that acceleration, we predicted the next speed point. So only the initial speed point, and then after that, all of the power values were used. And then, of course, you know, late in the trial, when power is lower, particularly in the kilo, you won't get acceleration anymore. It'll be deceleration, but that's simple enough. So how'd that work? Well, here is that same data from Sean Eady. The black is his actual power data. And the gray, hopefully you can see that they're different. The gray is the model prediction. That's his. Then this is data for Anna Mears, you know, 11-time world champion, riding a 500 meters. And this is Shane Kelly, I think 96 Olympic champion, maybe, riding a kilometer. And oh, by the way, when you see these variations in speed, that does not mean they're slowing down and speeding up. This is actually wheel speed, and wheel speed exceeds center of mass speed when they're in the turn because the tires are going faster than the center of mass. And so that's what you're seeing here. And the model takes all of that into account. And so across these three trials, we had an R squared of, well, almost 0.99. And the regression was y equals x, 1.0 equals 1.0. That's pretty good. And a standard error of speed of less, about 1/4 meter per second. Okay. So let me stop there. I know I went over this quickly, but let me ask if there are any questions on the demand model. Anything in the chat box? Let's see. Okay. Well, hopefully then it's really clear. But again, if a question occurs to you, flag me down. We'll go back. So now, you know, by showing you these figures say that if I know the rider's power, I can very, very accurately predict his or her speed and therefore overall performance. And so that sets the stage for if I could come up with a supply model that was accurate, then we know that I could accurately model performance. And the beauty of that is that if you have that tool, you can then evaluate a variety of what-if scenarios that you couldn't do with a rider, because you can't get the rider to go out and produce identical power with a range of conditions. Dr. Beeney, I noticed there are 4 chats. Maybe if you want to monitor those and let me know if there are any questions, I'll field them for you. So can we come up with, and of course I'm tipping my hat, right? I've got a line here. Can we come up with a supply model that will be accurate during maximal fatiguing exercise? And that's a challenge. And what I'm showing here is Hugh Morton's 3-component hydraulic model. And this really has to be the most elegant model I know of. It's incredibly difficult. I actually always think about maybe someday offering an entire graduate muscle physiology course based on this model. The problem with it is twofold. One, it has so many parameters that are so hard to measure that you could spend an entire week in a lab trying to parameterize the model. And then you don't know if those parameters would hold during the actual competition sometime later. But more importantly, I think, well, or equally important, this model produces one outcome variable, this W term. And that's a problem because power is highly dependent on pedaling rate or cadence, power and torque. So for cycling, pretty well established that the torque cadence relationship is linear. There are some authors saying that it's a little bit curved. We actually have some data in the pipe right now showing that, yes, it is a little bit curved. And about half of the subjects show a curve in one direction and about half of them show a curve in the other direction. So on average, it's still linear, which is kind of fun. But anyway, the point here is that linear torque cadence relationship gives rise to a quadratic power cadence relationship, which has a maximum value at about 120 to 125 RPM, and less than that on either side. So first of all, you have to have a model that incorporates cadence. And then secondly, and this is where it gets really tricky, when you look at a fatigued state, not only does the power come down, so this line is power cadence relationship in a rested state. This is a power cadence relationship in a fatigued state. And at least in theory, this is Brian McIntosh, a friend of mine. It's a groundbreaking paper, and it's supposed to represent one fatigue state. So a rested state and a fatigue state. And when that's the case, there's a problem in that the decrease in power that you experience is going to depend on the cadence. So for instance, if you were out here at, let's say, 140 RPM, these riders would have experienced a huge drop in power. As a percentage, this would be what, maybe 75, 80% drop in power. On the other hand, if they were over at this lower cadence, they would have been producing a little less power at the start, but then the effect of fatigue or the decrease in power is dramatically less. And that's because the shape of the power pedaling rate relationship changes with fatigue. Now, there's one problem with this data by Brian, and that is that, sadly, these torque cadence and therefore these power cadence relationships, those protocols are themselves fatiguing. And so you have an attempt to get a rested state and a fatigue state, but in order to do that, you're using a fatiguing protocol. So in other words, this data point here represents more fatigue than these up here, and the same is true for this being more fatigued than this. So that's a problem that no one has solved yet. We actually are working on it. And so to get around this, Heisenberg issue, we came up with a technique called biokinetic cycling. And this can be a little bit hard to get your mind around, but let me try to walk you through it. So the blue here is cadence. And we start out in this data set, we started out at 150 RPM. And the rider, and the red is power. So the rider's fatiguing. And then at about 18 seconds, we throw a switch, if you will, and we change the cadence from 150 down to 90. And when you do that, just as you would predict, based on this, if you're out here at 150, you've got a lot of fatigue. If you go back to 90, the power will be much higher. And that's exactly what we see here. And so then we take it just one little step further. Because these relationships are very linear with time, we can extrapolate forward on this data set into the middle of that transition area. And once things are stabilized, we can extrapolate backwards here. And so these two stars, we believe, represent the exact same fatigue state with no Heisenberg issue when at two different cadences. And so we can use those to construct power cadence and torque cadence relationships in a fatigue state without Heisenberg principle. And as I said, I know, and I know this from being in my lab with a number of grad students, I know this can be hard to get your mind around. So I have a video. So let's see if I can just go over here and play that right here.
Go, come on, you got it. As hard as you
so
can.
Here you see a high pedal grade in this case.
Let's go, come on. Every pedal stroke as hard as you can.
I'm not sure what that is. That looks like 120 maybe. It could be 160.
Keep going. You're almost there. Keep pushing.
And then right here.
Keep pushing as hard as you can. Come on, keep going. All right, now
there went the button.
catch up as hard as you can.
Oh, there we go.
Let's go. Come on, breathe.
Now we went up from 120 to 160.
Sit down. Stand. Nice.
We were also taking muscle twitch and EMG at the end of that. Oops, let's go back here. So any questions on that particular technique and what we're trying to get with that? I know that it can be challenging. Dr. Beanie, anything in the chat? Okay. All right. Right group. Let's go forward then. So we've been using this, and this is some early data. We've got a ton more. In fact, some of you may have noticed the New Zealand kit here. This study was Renee Wolf actually worked with us so that he wrote these fatiguing protocols into the New Zealand team's training program. This was part of their training. This is the Trexlertown Velodrome in Pennsylvania. So these are world-class, world champion cyclists in this study. And this is not their data. These are some lab data. I don't have those assembled yet, but they tell the same story. So what we found was that if you look at the torque cadence relationship, what you find is that it's almost, not quite, but almost parallel in the rested and the fatigue state. And although this looks a little different to your eye, it's not significantly different statistically. And then we found that the Tmax term decreases at about 1.35% per second during maximal exercise. That's a limitation of this model. It requires maximal exercise only. We're currently working on robust, high but non-maximal power as well. But for this presentation, we'll focus on this time-based model. And so now that we know that, we can go in and we can create power cadence relationships after 5, 10, 15, and 20 seconds of cycling. And we can use that to model power as it goes across different cadences. Okay. And so here's an example. So far we've only done this bikinetic or isokinetic one at a time. But, that doesn't really matter all that much to real world cycling, because in real world cycling, you're accelerating or decelerating all the time. You've got gear choices. So cadence can always be changing. And that's true also of a Wingate test. So we had the subjects from these data also do a Wingate test. And so here you see their power, and here you see their cadence. And then we applied our model to that, which, as I said, Tmax changes relative to previous values. The torque cadence slope changes a little bit, not too much, not significantly. And then we used forward integration to predict our new Tmax at each point in time based on the previous Tmax and the original rested Tmax and this decay rate. And when we do that, and we compare the Wingate model to the Wingate actual, you see, so again, the black is still the original Wingate test, and now the red is the model, and the R squared here is 0.96, suggesting that they're essentially the same, but not quite. And I guess, again, I should be happy with 0.96, but these 2 points right here are a problem. I think that these are just a time sink issue, that we could not exactly sync things across all the subjects. And so we have some variability here. If you take these 2 points out, this jumps to 0.975. And then there's also this bit that's kind of curious. And I think what this represents is that some of the subjects stood up briefly here. So I think the demand model, or the supply model, is actually pretty good and maybe better than this 0.96 for an R squared. So promising at least. And now, again, let me criticize my own techniques. So the method I just showed you for establishing those model parameters requires 6 maximal fatiguing trials. It requires a custom-built Biokinetic ergometer that only my lab has. Nobody else has one that I know of. And so it simply is not practical in a high-performance sports setting. So you can simplify the model by neglecting the non-significant slope changes. And the question then is, can you get this Tmax fatigue rate from field data? Because if you can, then you can parameterize the model based on the cyclist's normal data that you get every day on a power meter. And so what we did here, we took those same data sets that you just saw from Australian cycling. Again, Anna, Shane, and Sean. And just based on those power cadence traces, based on lab data that we had on their resting condition, we, my battery's getting low. Hang on a second. There we go. We were able to basically tease out the Tmax slope. And as you see here, when we did that, we got very, very good agreement suggesting that this simplified model, which you can parameterize from field data, actually works really well. So let me pause here and see if there's any questions on the supply side. See who's on this call. Okay, well, all right, well, we'll just plow ahead then. Again, stop me anytime. So the last phase is to actually apply this model to evaluate a few scenarios. And so with that in mind, I know it's hard to talk on Zoom, but you're going to have to because we got a pop quiz coming up. So here's the pop quiz. What factors can a rider actually control going into the final sprint? And you're going to have to tell me. What do you think? What do you have control over?
The position to a certain degree.
I heard position.
The position in the bunch, but only up to a
Yes.
certain degree.
Perfect. That's one. Position in the bunch. I've got two more in mind. What else can you do when you're leading into a sprint? Oh, I see chat things coming up. How do you? Let's see. CDA, yes, aerodynamics, gear ratio, perfect. Yes, you can also control your gear ratio, which controls your cadence, and you control how you sit on the bike, which changes your aerodynamics. Excellent, A+. So those are the three things that we're going to model and see what we get. So now, of course, in order to properly model, the model has to start with initial conditions. And those include the rider's position relative to the competitor's position, so position in the bunch. And then in addition to that, the rider's speed as well as the competitor's speed, cadence, the fatigue state, you know, these bunch sprints take place at the end of hours of racing, the actual power, the aerodynamic drag, which again is interactive. It's going to rely on the rider's position and the competitor's position and the speed. And then, of course, the mass or inertia of the system. That's the initial conditions. Within the sprint, we will, as you just saw, we will model speed as a function of time and power and aerodynamic drag. And then embedded in this is the power model, which is a function of time or fatigue and cadence. And then, of course, the only parameter for the end that matters, the final conditions, is whether you're here or here. So here's our first. As we mentioned, you know, these sprints take place at the end of hours of racing, and so fortunately, Paolo has data on Pro Tour sprinters and showing that their peak power within the sprint at the end of Grand Tour races is about 1,250 watts. But he knows from lab testing that their rested power is in the 1,450 to 1,500 watt range. And so we can, based on that, we can model what should happen to the entire power cadence relationship. And so this red is a 1,250 peak and with a slightly reduced maximum cadence and optimal cadence based on fatigue. So, and that's important. This part is really important because we need to get the initial conditions right. So the first modeling scenario will be aerodynamic position, and this is a Matt Goss story. You saw in the initial video one of Cavendish's wins was over Matt Goss in the World Championships. And this is actually sort of a tragic hero story, but with a happy ending. So following this race, Dave Martin, which ended what, less than a wheel apart, maybe half a meter. Dave Martin, who some of you may know, he organized a trip to the wind tunnel. And he had taken these pictures of Cavendish. These are 4 positions that Cavendish has been photographed during a sprint. So here's his head up with high shoulders, his head down with high shoulders, then a low shoulder position with his head up, and a low shoulder position with his head down. And this pretty much closely approximates what Matt Goss usually does. And so they got Matt Goss's drag in this position, his normal position. And then all he had to do was drop his head. And when he dropped his head, he reduced his drag by 6%. When he dropped his shoulders but kept his head up, he dropped it 10%. And when he dropped both his head and his shoulders, he dropped his drag 12%. So we took those different CDAs and used them to model what would have happened had he changed those or adopted those position changes. So if we use the high shoulder head up position as our baseline, if he had simply dropped his head, he would have finished about 1.8 meters ahead of where he did finish. So instead of half a meter behind, he would have been over a meter ahead of Cavendish here. If he had also, or if he had dropped his shoulders but had his head up so he could see where he's going, that would have been even better. He would have been over 2.5 meters ahead of where he was. So he would have been a little over a bike length up on Cavendish. And then if he had dropped his head as well, he would have been bike length plus a gap. Now, sadly, the reason this is a tragic hero story is, according to Dave Martin, Matt would not adopt any of these. He was adamant that they were dangerous, that he would crash, that he wouldn't be able to produce power. And so he never changed. And so it could just be a tragic hero story and that could be the end of it. But those of you who know Dave Martin, you know that he has Jedi master mind control properties. So at that same wind tunnel session was a young Caleb Ewan. And what Dave said to him was, hey, Caleb, why don't you get in the tunnel and just get in some crazy position, a position you could never actually ride in, and let's just see what would happen. Let's see how low we can get your drag. You'll never ride it, but let's just try. And I think those of you who follow cycling, and I guess you all do, you'll know that in fact, he can ride in this position and has won Grand Tour stages doing exactly what other people thought could not be done. So it has a happy ending, at least for one of the players in the story. The next thing we can look at from your pop quiz is gear ratio. And if we look at the data that Paolo published, we can get the cadence averaged over the whole sprint and the peak. And from that, and the speed. And so from that, we can calculate the gear ratio because we don't know what gear ratio they're in, but we can calculate it. And what we get for this data set is that they were, on average, they were in a gear of 4.66 to 1, or in cycling terms, they were in a 53-11.4, which of course isn't possible. So they were in a 12 half the time roughly and 11 half the time. And so we can model these two gears against each other. And we can also evaluate a range of starting speeds characteristic of what was reported. So here we've got, I actually changed this. That's a typo now. So we went from 55 kph for a low to 70 kph for a high. And here's what we found. So we modeled two scenarios based on the data. We saw that the range of the length of the sprint tended to be between 7 and 11 seconds for the all-out committed sprint at the end. And you can see this in the data trace. And so based on the starting speeds, which ranged from 55 to 70 kilometers per hour, we then looked at what would happen if you changed, if you were in the 12 or the 11, and we compared the 11 to the 12. So the 12 is the baseline here, and both of these represent the 11. The red is the 11-second sprints, and the black is the 7-second sprints. And what you see is, I guess this is just gratifying, that the data show that about half the time they're in 11, half the time they're in the 12, and the model shows that about half the time the 11 wins and half the time the 12 wins. So I'm not sure we made any groundbreaking discovery here, other than to confirm that yes, these two are in the right range. If you're going to start from a slower speed, you're probably better off in the 12. And if you're going to start from a higher speed, you're probably better off in the 11. Not groundbreaking, but sort of confirmative. Now, one thing that's really important here, and I mentioned this earlier, is the shape of the power cadence relationship at the start of the sprint. And I showed you this, and we don't know if that's true, and you're never going to find out if it's true, because you're not going to get somebody to go out and ride a 6-hour race and then come into your lab immediately and do a sprint. But we did something not exactly the same in my lab, but we did a fatiguing trial. These powers look low. That's because these are single leg values. We did all 10-minute time trials, sorry. And we saw a decrease in max power, of course, and a small decrease in maximum cadence, which looks a lot like what we modeled here. So I think this is pretty realistic. So I think these results will stand up. And then our last scenario to explore is your position within the peloton, your position relative to your competitors. And of course, track riders know that if you leave a gap, you can accelerate into that gap, get a much higher speed, and that enables you to pass your competitor. And Nathan Barry, in his PhD, did a lot of rider-rider interaction, so I can actually very accurately model the reduction in draft that comes from following another rider with his data. And so that's fine on the track, but on the road, it's more difficult because the riders are so tightly packed. And if you leave a gap, somebody may stick their bike in it and you won't have a gap anymore. Well, but if you look at this overhead shot, you will see that there are gaps that these riders could potentially be taking advantage of. Certainly gaps less than a meter, they can't shove their bike into. And so that's what I did. I modeled a meter, a half a meter, and a quarter meter of a gap. The lead and the following rider in this model scenario both have exactly the same power and exactly the same aerodynamic drag when not drafting anyway. And so how does that work out? Well, it's incredibly beneficial to start with a gap. So what this shows, again, at a variety of speeds, if you start with a 1 meter gap, so you're 1 meter behind, you're whatever, 1.8 meters for your bike, plus another meter behind the rider, and you win in each of these scenarios by between 1 meter and about 1.7 meters. If you start with a 0.5 meter gap, like this, you win by between a 0.5 meter and about 0.8. If you only start 25 centimeters back, you only don't win in the slowest condition. And in the other conditions, you actually are able to make the pass. And you're able to do that because what happens is you and your lead out rider both start accelerating at the same time, but your aerodynamic drag is greatly reduced. And so you accelerate at a much greater rate. Now, at some point right here at this inflection point, you get to that rider's rear wheel and you have to move out. And at that point, you stop accelerating as much as you were, but you're going so much faster that you get to continue around. And then this is the position difference on this axis here. So in this case, we're starting a meter behind, and you end up, in this case, 1.8 meters ahead. Hope that helps. So for these modeling parameters, oh gosh, I should have rewritten that. Postural changes offer large benefits. Don't read that. The 11 and the 12 work about half the time, with the 12 being better in the slower starting conditions, and accelerating into a gap facilitates passing. And so, yes, perhaps you can give your athletes more of that mysterious gift that thrills the millions. And I have to acknowledge all my coworkers on this: Andy Francione, who was with Garmin, Dave Martin, Nick Brown, who's at University of Canberra, Steve Head of Head Wheels, and of course, rest in peace, he passed away untimely. And then the cyclists, the students, and all my colleagues that have contributed to this. And I'll stop there and thank you for your attention and open the field to any questions.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much for a very, very informative presentation. There was a question from the earlier section, so I've noted that here, around the CDA. So there was a question around, do you think the results will be similar today from your early studies with the wind tunnel, given the CDA values have dropped quite dramatically? Oh, sure. Yeah. I think that the difference will be quantitative, not qualitative. I think that the model holds up based on what the CDA is. And as you lower it, speeds go up, but the model, I think, will still drive properly. I think that's the question, right? Yep. Yeah, sure. The aerodynamics have improved dramatically, so speeds are up, but I think the model still holds. There's another question that just came through. How practical do you think, how practical do you think the biokinetic cycling would be on the field? Oh, it's not. It's not at all. And that's the point of using field data to tease out the Tmax fatigue rate, which we did in this data set. I've also done it in 2 groups of cyclists that I'm working with currently. And the model, the backing it out and then checking it against the data works very, very well. And so we've been using that to optimize gear ratios, run-in speed for the 200, that kind of thing. Wonderful. Thank you. Let's see if we have any more questions coming through. Oh, I see quite a few more things in the chat. Maybe I should open that. Yeah. Just people thanking you for the presentation. So multiple notes thanking for the presentation. Also finish how to extrapolate. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think everybody's quite happy with the outcomes, which is great. I'm mindful of the time, and I'll thank again everyone for joining, and particularly thank Jim again for the presentation. And then for those that have questions, yeah, please send that through, because then we can facilitate communication with Jim if you need a hand. The recording will be available hopefully later today on YouTube. I'll see how my putting up skills actually work, but it should be fine. Yeah, there's one just came through very recently. Do you know how cadence power relations change for different gears? Does this change RPM at peak power, or does it only move the curve up and downwards?
So I think the question is, what's going on with the power cadence relationship? And I think you're always going to see decreases in power with fatigue, and that's always going to be accompanied with a change in the maximum cadence, and therefore a change in the entire power cadence relationship. Am I answering the question, Dr. Beeney?
I think so, or at least from my understanding, yes.
Okay, good.
Great, thanks again. I'll close the room, and then thank you everybody for joining, and look forward for, keep an eye on future webinars. We're working on trying to get other guest speakers for these sessions moving forward.
And if anybody wants to reach out to me, if you do have some questions that come to mind, I'm at the University of Utah. I'm easy to find, and my email is just jim.martin@utah.edu.